Have you ever been absolutely certain about a specific memory? Just sure it happened a certain way, only to find out later that, oh, some details just couldn't have happened like that. I know I have. Um, I vividly remember my first day of ninth grade. Huge deal, right? Big school transition. I remember this fight with my mom about my outfit and walking past my old middle school and smelling lilacs, like really strongly, in full bloom. But here's the thing, lilacs bloom in the spring. My first day of ninth grade, that was September. So it's pretty unlikely I actually smelled lilacs that day. So what was my brain doing? What is going on when we remember things?
That's a brilliant place to start, actually, because it hits the nail on the head for what we're digging into today. Memory isn't this perfect recording device, not like a video camera running in your head or data saved perfectly on a hard drive. It's much more dynamic. It's a reconstructive process. So today we're going to explore how your brain really accesses the past and why getting this can fundamentally change how you see your own history and maybe more importantly, your mental well-being too. It's kind of amazing the power and the subtle tricks our minds play.
Okay, so if it's not a perfect recording, how did we even get that idea in the first place? What was the old way of thinking about memory?
Yeah, for a long time, the main view was pretty much shaped by early researchers. Think Hermann Ebbinghaus, He studied memory using like nonsense syllables in a lab, very controlled. And that led to this idea of memory as a giant storage warehouse. Experiences perfectly filed away. You just pull out the right box and bam, there it is. Exactly as it happened. But then came Sir Frederick Bartlett, and he really shook things up. He looked beyond the lab. He believed that in everyday life, memory isn't just storage. It relies hugely on what he called world knowledge and schemata.
Schemata, like mental frameworks, blueprints.
Exactly, like scripts almost. You have a schema for going to a restaurant or what usually happens at a birthday party. These frameworks help us organize information.
Okay, so it's not just what you recorded, but how it fits into what you already know or expect. Got it. What about his famous study, the War of the Ghosts? What did that show about how memory works out in the real world?
Ah, yes. Iconic study. He had people read this quite unusual Native American folktale. Then he asked them to recall it over time, weeks, months, sometimes even years later. And what he found was fascinating. People consistently misremembered. They distorted details. But they weren't trying to lie or anything. They were actively making the story, more rational and more coherent from their own point of view. That was his phrasing. They changed bits to fit their own cultural understanding.
Like what? Can you give an example?
Sure. Like the original story mentioned foggy and calm weather. Over time, some participants changed that to a dark and stormy night.
Why? Well, probably because in their cultural stories, a dark and stormy night is a more common signal of something mysterious or bad about to happen. It just fit their schema better.
Wow. So our brains aren't just passively forgetting, they're actively kind of rewriting memories to fit our own narratives. Precisely. That's the key takeaway. Bartlett totally rejected that warehouse idea for long-term memory. He saw memory as this active and often inaccurate process. It encodes and retrieves information so that it makes sense to us now. So every time you remember something, you're essentially recreating it. You're weaving it together with your current knowledge, your beliefs. It's not a playback. It's more like a performance.
Okay, mind blown a little. So if memory is this fluid, reconstructive thing, what does that mean for our autobiographical memories? The really personal stuff, the stories of our lives that make us who we think we are.
It means they're way more fluid than we usually think. Way more. Research by Linton, for example, found people often use problem-solving strategies to piece together their past, even when they don't have a direct, explicit memory. Think about it like this. If I asked you, where were you on June 28th, 2016, at exactly 11:35 a.m.?
No idea. Absolutely none.
Yeah, right? That's most people's first reaction. But then you might start thinking, okay, June 28th, that's summer, 2016. What was I doing that summer? Oh, I had that job at the bookstore. Let's say June 25th was my cousin's wedding. That was a Saturday. So the 28th must have been a Tuesday.
Yeah.
11:35 a.m. on a Tuesday, I would have definitely been at work, probably shelving books in the back.
Hey.
You haven't necessarily remembered it directly. You've reconstructed it using logic, dates, general knowledge about your routines.
Yeah, okay, I've totally done that. It really does feel like building a plausible story, not pulling up a video clip. And it goes deeper, right? Like our brains seem to prefer these sort of summarized stories over exact snapshots.
Absolutely. Barcelow's research showed exactly that. When asked about the past, people tend to report summarized events like, oh, I went to the beach every day that week, or extended events like, I spent the summer volunteering at that camp. We don't usually focus on single specific moments unless something makes them stand out. This narrative tendency even connects to things like infantile amnesia, why most of us can't remember our first few years. Though recent findings suggest the average earliest memory might be around 2.5 years old now, a bit earlier than we thought. But the point is, these autobiographical stories, these narratives are fundamental. They help us build and understand who we are, our values, our goals. They even shape how we think about the future. They are our identity in a way.
But hang on, what about those memories that feel absolutely burned in, super vivid, super emotional, like where you were when you heard about 9/11, or maybe a big personal shock? Are those different? Are they immune to this reconstruction?
That's a really important question. Those are what researchers R. Brown and Kulik called flashbulb memories back in '77. They define them as these incredibly vivid, detailed recollections of learning about surprising, consequential events, stuff that was high emotional impact. The initial theory was maybe that intense emotional response triggers something special in the brain. Maybe it activates certain areas, like the amygdala, leading to the super detailed storage, including all the surrounding details, where you were, who told you what you were doing. They feel photographic, almost.
So the idea was strong emotion equals perfect memory, but did anyone push back on that? It still feels like it could fit the reconstruction idea somehow.
You're right to be skeptical. Ulrich Neisser, another major figure, he offered a different take. He suggested flashbulb memories might arise partly because these events make us feel like we're linking ourselves to history. The emotion makes the event feel significant, so we talk about it. We tell our story of where I was when, over and over. And just like with Bartlett's folktale, each retelling offers a chance for the memory to be, well, subtly reshaped, elaborated, maybe filled in with plausible details to make it a better, more coherent story.
So the act of retelling, which the emotion drives, could actually make the memory less accurate over time. That feels really backward.
It does, doesn't it? But there's evidence for it. Stephen Schmidt did a study right after 9/11. He surveyed students the next day, then again a couple of months later. Central details were pretty consistent, yeah. But here's the kicker. The students who reported the strongest emotional reaction, they actually showed the most impairment remembering peripheral details. Things like what they were wearing, or who else was exactly there. Even someone like President George W. Bush. His own public accounts of where he was and what he was doing when he first heard about the attacks showed inconsistencies over time. Despite the obvious emotional weight of that event for him, it seems like maybe the intense emotion focuses you laser-like on the core event, but the surrounding context gets a bit fuzzy or jumbled.
Wow. Okay. And what about long-term? You mentioned people retelling. Did that 10-year follow-up study on 9/11 memories look at confidence? Did people realize their memories might have shifted?
That's the really interesting part from the Hearst study, the 10-year follow-up. They found, yes, there was forgetting, especially in the first year, for both the flashbulb details and the general event facts. But then it kind of leveled off. But crucially, people's confidence in their memories, it did not diminish over the 10 years. They stayed just as certain, even if the details had drifted. And even more striking, once an inconsistency entered a flashbulb memory report, it tended to be repeated in subsequent reports. It got logged in. Whereas errors about the general event facts, those could sometimes be corrected later. So the personal emotional component seems more resistant to correction, even if inaccurate. That strong feeling makes the memory feel undeniably real, even if parts of it aren't quite right anymore.
Okay, this leads directly into something critical. Eyewitness memory. I mean, imagine being on a jury. Someone points a finger, absolutely confident, says, that's the one. That feels incredibly convincing, doesn't it? But if memory is this, bendy, how reliable is that in a courtroom?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a huge problem. Elizabeth Loftus, who we mentioned earlier, she's done groundbreaking work on this. She famously said, there is almost nothing more convincing than a live human being who takes the stand, points a finger at the defendant, and says, that's the one. And yet, her research consistently shows eyewitness testimony is surprisingly unreliable. Jurors tend to believe it, especially if the witness seems confident, but that confidence, it's often misplaced.
So it's not just about forgetting details, it's that the memory itself can be actively changed by what? Suggestion. How easily can that happen?
Very easily, unfortunately. One of her classic studies really shows this. Participants watched a film of a car accident. Later, some were asked questions that included misleading information. For instance, one group was asked, how fast was the white sports car going when it passed the barn while traveling along the country road? Simple question, right? Except there was no barn in the film, none at all. A week later, when asked if they remembered seeing a barn, 17% of the group who got the misleading question said yes, compared to less than 3% of the control group.
17%. Just
Yeah.
from a question about something that wasn't there.
Exactly. It shows how malleable memory is. It's like our brain takes the original memory trace and sort of integrates the later suggestion into it. It creates a new distorted memory. It's like building with Legos, and someone hands you a piece from a different set, but you manage to jam it in anyway, and now it looks like it belongs there.
Wow. Okay. Is there anything new or any research that helps us maybe spot when someone is reconstructing rather than truly recalling, especially in, say, legal situations?
Yes, there is some interesting work on what are called retrieval effort cues. Research by Gustafson and colleagues in 2022 looked into this. They found that signs someone is working hard to retrieve a memory, things like pausing for longer than 2 seconds or using hedges like I think, maybe, sort of, these are actually more common when the memory being recalled is incorrect.
So hesitating might mean they're less accurate.
It's a predictor, yeah. Delays and hedges were the strongest ones they found. But here's another really crucial, maybe slightly counterintuitive finding from their work regarding confidence. While generally, yes, confidence often correlates with accuracy, they found that when people repeatedly recalled memories, confidence increased over time, mainly for the incorrect memories.
Wait, what? Confidence went up for the wrong memories?
That's what they found in the group that practiced recalling. It highlights a potential danger. An eyewitness might be initially unsure about a detail, but through repeated questioning, or maybe preparing their testimony, they become more confident over time, even if that detail was wrong to begin with. They become overconfident in an inaccuracy.
Okay, so if memory is this malleable and suggestions can warp it and confidence isn't a guarantee, it leads to a really unsettling question. Can totally false memories of entire events that just never happened, actually be planted? It sounds like something from science fiction.
It does, but sadly it seems possible. There was a really dramatic real-world case, the Eileen Franklin case, that brought this into the spotlight. A woman claims she suddenly recovered a repressed memory of witnessing her father commit a murder more than 20 years earlier. Her testimony led to his conviction. That case, and others like it, really ignited a huge debate about so-called repressed memories versus potentially recovered or purely false memories.
And I remember there was controversy around some self-help books around that time too, right? Ones that seemed to suggest ways to find forgotten memories.
Exactly. Books like The Courage to Heal, for instance, were criticized because they suggested that if you had certain symptoms, low self-esteem, depression, then abuse probably did happen, even if you didn't remember it. And they sometimes recommended using imagination exercises to try and recall specifics, which, given everything we now know about memory's reconstructive nature, well, that's a very risky approach. It could inadvertently lead someone to create a memory rather than recover one. This is where Loftus and Pickrell's famous Lost in the Mall study from 1995 comes in. It was groundbreaking.
Right, tell us about that one. How did they actually test if a false memory could be planted?
They talked to the participants' parents to get real childhood memories. Then they created a short narrative about a plausible but entirely fictional event. Getting lost in a shopping mall for an extended period as a child, being frightened, and eventually being rescued by an elderly person. They presented this false story alongside the true ones. And get this, in the initial study, 29%, almost a third of the participants later recalled details about this completely false event, some quite vividly. Even weeks later, some still maintained at least a partial memory of being lost in the mall, an event that never occurred.
That is genuinely shocking. How did they think it worked? How does a suggestion become a full-blown memory?
Their idea was basically that the suggestion plants a seed. It leaves a trace in the mind. Then your brain connects that trace to other related knowledge you have. What malls are like, feelings of being lost, maybe fragments of real experiences. And through imagination, inference, and elaboration, these grains of experienced events or imagined events are integrated, as they put it. Your mind essentially builds a narrative around the suggestion, making it feel like a real memory. And it wasn't just that study. Others have managed to implant false memories too, sometimes using doctored photographs, although just telling a compelling story often seemed more effective.
It's powerful evidence, but should we be careful about applying findings from, say, being lost in a mall to something much more complex and traumatic, like abuse?
That's a very important caution, absolutely. Critics like Pesdek raised this point back in the 90s. We shouldn't necessarily overgeneralize findings from these kinds of lab studies, which often involve relatively simple, plausible events to deeply traumatic, complex memories. Pesdek used a great analogy. Just because aeronautical engineers can show mathematically that a bumblebee shouldn't be able to fly doesn't mean bumblebees don't fly. They clearly do. Similarly, just because an explanation exists for how false memories could be formed does not mean that false memories actually are formed in this way. In all circumstances, especially highly traumatic ones, there's likely more complexity involved.
Okay, so hearing all this, it can feel a bit unsettling, right? Our memories aren't perfect recordings. They can be influenced. False ones might even be created. But could there be an upside? Could this very malleability, this reconstructive nature, actually be helpful? Could we use this understanding to help people heal?
That's exactly where the research is heading, and it's incredibly hopeful. First, we need to understand something called memory consolidation. That's the natural process where a new memory becomes stable over time. It involves bone structures like the hippocampus, moving the memory trace into more permanent storage, often linking it with emotional context via the amygdala. That's how memories get set. But the really exciting part is what can happen after a memory is consolidated.
Which is memory reconsolidation, right? This idea that when you recall an old memory, it becomes temporarily unstable, flexible again.
Precisely. And this opens up amazing therapeutic possibilities. Lane and colleagues, back in 2015, proposed a model for how therapy, especially for trauma, can leverage this reconsolidation window. It involves basically 3 steps. 1, you carefully help the person reactivate the old, difficult memory in a safe therapeutic setting. 2, while that memory is active and malleable, you introduce new emotional experiences, maybe feelings of safety, empowerment, or perspective that weren't there originally. These new experiences get incorporated into the reactivated memory trace as it restabilizes. And 3, you reinforce this newly integrated memory structure by helping the person practice new ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving in response to memory triggers. So essentially, you're not erasing the memory, but you're updating it. You're making revisions and storing it within a healthier, less distressing context.
So the same flexibility that makes memory vulnerable can actually be used to kind of rewrite or recontextualize traumatic memories, helping people cope and move forward. That is genuinely amazing. Beyond that, are there other everyday things that impact how well we retrieve memories?
Oh, absolutely. Loads of things. Like attention, if you weren't really paying attention when something happened, good luck recalling it clearly later. Encoding matters hugely. Context is another big one. You know, the feeling of going back to an old place and memories flooding back, that's context-dependent retrieval. Being in the same environment helps. Motivation can play a role too. If you're really motivated to be accurate, you might retrieve more precise details. Then there's interference. New information can mess with your recall of older stuff, especially in short-term memory. And even your state matters, like state-dependent memory. If you learn something while, say, tired or after taking certain medication, you might recall it better when you're in that same state again. It's kind of weird. Oh, and substances, obviously. Alcohol can cause blackouts, literally blocking new memory formation. Stimulants might boost recall short-term, but mess things up long-term. Even gender differences show up. Females often edge out males on recalling specific life events or noticing nonverbal cues.
Wow, so many factors. It really drives home the point, doesn't it?
It really does. The core message here is that your memory is this incredibly dynamic, active, constantly reconstructing process. It's shaped by everything, your emotions, your beliefs, what you learn later, how often you think about something. It's not a perfect archive. It's more like a constantly updated story your brain tells itself to make sense of the world, your past, and your place in it.
Which means, really, that your personal history isn't some fixed document set in stone. It's a living, breathing narrative. It just highlights how adaptable our brains really are.
Exactly. It's about adaptation and meaning-making, not just perfect recall.
So thinking about all this, if our memories are always being rebuilt, always influenced, what does that really mean for how we understand our own personal truth, our identity, and maybe most importantly, how we learn and heal? How can we lean into this fluid nature of memory, not just be wary of it, but actually use it to shape a healthier, more informed future for ourselves? Lots to think about there. Join us next time on The Deep Dive.